Welcome to the Family Systems lecture. Let's get started. So, Bronfenbrenner's is one of the theorists with this approach. And this approach is very unique because historically, so far, we've spent all of this time focusing on individuals. So, who's the one client sitting across from you? Maybe a couple. We've talked about group therapy. So, we've talked about a couple different approaches, but primarily, it's all been individual therapy. Whereas this approach is much more taking that step back and looking at the bigger picture in terms of what's the system this person is in or what's the environment that someone is in. And so when we look at children specifically, this view incorporates or focuses on child development and looks at the complex system and relationships, and all of those things are impacted by multiple levels of factors such as the surrounding environment. So if you look at the picture on the slide, there's a lot to be thinking about in terms of not only do you have the microsystem, so for example, think the immediate household, who's living in the household, where's the child going to school, where do their family members work, so their parents, for example, who are their friends, are they going to church, who are those individuals that they're interacting with, so all of these factors are kind of very central to what that microsystem is. And then if you take a step out even further, it would consider factors like where does the child go for a doctor's appointment, who is on the school board, who is involved in terms of the parent situation, where their work and their work environment. And so you continue to kind of take these steps back to look at overall what are all of the factors that are impacting this child and this child's development. And then there's even more that we can add in, right? So if we think about a child who's born and raised in, say, New York City, and all of the cultural and environmental factors that are occurring there versus someone who's raised in, say, the Midwest or on the West Coast, and all of the different factors, say someone who's raised in the South, in Louisiana, and what are the systemic factors or environmental factors that are present there, and how all of those end up impacting someone's development, and who we become, what our values are, what our beliefs are, what our priorities are, what our goals are. And something else to think about and pay attention to is what does this also look like if there's some type of abuse occurring? And someone who experiences child abuse is again going to be different and approach situations very differently than someone who is maybe raised in a very loving or supportive home or environment. And so, again, just to summarize, this approach, family systems and family therapy overall, takes this much broader approach in terms of looking at kind of everything involved within a system, not just the individual that we tend to treat or the individual that we tend to sit across from. On page 407 of the textbook, I like this because it's kind of very central to this approach, specifically in terms of, one of the questions on the page is, something to the extent of what do people do when I act one way or the other? Or how do people react to me when I do something or when I say something? So if we have poor boundaries, we're essentially teaching people how to treat us or how to interact with us. In a previous class, I had a student who posted in the discussion about how she had told a supervisor, I believe, that she didn't want to be touched, I guess the supervisor would like touch her on the arm or, like touch her on the shoulder. And she said, please don't do that. Please stop that. And she eventually left working at that company because the supervisor continued to do it. So he or she, whoever the supervisor was, continued to cross that person's boundaries, even though that person said, hey, here's my boundary. I'm asking you not to do this. And so by leaving the organization, she was essentially saying, it's not okay to treat me this way. This is my boundary. I've asked you not to cross it, and yet you continue to cross it. So I'm going to choose not to continue to work here. And of course, she was in a position where she could do that. Of course, some people, if they're in that situation, can't do that because they need that job or they need that money. But essentially, this is looking at what do you allow, especially within situations that are within your control? So if your family treats you a certain way, are you comfortable with that? Are you fine with that? Are you setting healthy boundaries with them if it's situations where healthy boundaries are needed? Or are you saying, it's okay, it's fine, it's not that big of a deal? Um, I've worked with several clients who have had to cut off family relationships or cut contact with family, or they really limit family contact and interactions because of how their family treats them. An example is I was working with someone who she was in her early 20s, and her mom was verbally abusive. Her mom would say things to her, would treat her in a certain way. And then when, my client would get mad at her mom or upset at her mom, she didn't really feel comfortable expressing that, right? Because she was raised in this environment where her mom would act this way. And of course, if you're 9 or 10 years old, you want your mother's love and you want your mom's affection and support and approval. And so she didn't really feel comfortable standing up for herself now that she was, in her early 20s. And so essentially what that resulted in is just kind of avoiding any conflict with her mom whenever possible, or just kind of limiting contact with her mom, period. Because in general, her mom would, like blow up at her, get really upset if my client didn't act in a way that her mom wanted her to, and then would come back, a couple days later, like, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to yell at you, or I didn't mean to say those things to you. Here is, whatever, here's some money, here's a gift card, here's a new iPhone. And would like essentially try and buy my client's love and affection after blowing up at her. And so my client over years had essentially gotten to a point of like, you know what, I don't need this conflict, or I don't need this drama in my life. And so she would very much limit the contact that she had with her family, or with her mom specifically, because her mom was kind of a toxic person because of the verbal abuse. And so again, this comes back to, she was telling her mom, hey, if you're going to, she was setting that boundary. Hey, if you're going to treat me this way, if you're going to yell at me, say these mean things to me, like, that's not how I want to be treated. And so I'm going to set this boundary, or I'm going to then choose to act or react in, this way or that way, etc. So I think I started this semester at some point early on with saying there are only over 400 different therapy types out there. And of course, there are more therapy approaches being developed continuously. And so you can see here on the slide that there's several different types of family therapy specifically that we could talk about. I won't go into depth in these because each one of these could take, become a several day workshop. But again, overall, the focus here is on understanding not only the individual, which is what we've spent all semester focusing on, but the individual within the system that they're in, their family system. And again, going back to that a previous slide in terms of all of the different environmental and system factors that are present. This chapter, in terms of the textbook, was surprisingly short. And so, again, there's multiple variations of family therapy that we could spend time on. And so, if this approach, family therapy in general, is something that specifically is interesting to you, then I would say spend time not only reading the textbook, seeing what kinds of different YouTube videos are out there, reading a couple books on it to go more in depth. Family therapy is not a therapy approach that I've ever experienced any interest in. Like, let me go work with this population specifically. That being said, of course, no one person lives on an island by themselves, right? And so when people come in for individual therapy, often it does kind of become this flavor of family therapy, because oftentimes individuals are coming to therapy and one of the issues that they might be experiencing is some type of conflict with a family member, a conflict with a brother, a conflict with parents, etc. And so it kind of oftentimes does take on kind of this flavor of family therapy as you're helping them develop and work on whatever those family relationships are. But again, it's still individual therapy in that sense, because the whole family isn't coming into therapy. So yeah, if this is something that interests you, definitely spend some more time learning about it. So the less developed a person's self is, the more impact others have on his or her functioning, and the more he or she tries to maybe control things, either actively or passively. And so paying attention to this, the basic building blocks of a self are, inborn, if you will. But in individuals' family relationships during childhood, adolescence, those often, of course, impact who we are and how we develop, and they impact that self. Another way to think of this is in terms of autonomy, so separation versus connection and togetherness. So if this is a spectrum, where does this person land on that spectrum of togetherness and connection versus that autonomy and separation? And again, kind of going back to that example that I just shared with a client of the client that I was working with, she was more on that end of separation and autonomy because of how her mom was treating her. In terms of a goal for this therapy approach, or just family therapy in general, it's increasing levels of differentiation where the focus is on making change for the self rather than on trying to change others. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. I'm not going to cover all of these. Triangulation, this is the process that occurs when a third person is introduced into a dyadic, so a dyadic being two relationship to either balance excessive intimacy, conflict, or distance, or to provide some type of stability. So an example of this, you probably did this when you were a child, or if you have children, you've probably experienced your children doing this to you. Have you ever done that thing where, like, I did this? Here's an example. You go to dad and you're like, Dad, can I have a soda? Or Dad, can I have a pop? Whatever whatever word you use. Can I have a soda? And dad says, I don't know. Go ask your mom. So then you're like, okay. So then you go ask mom, hey mom, can I have a soda? So now you're triangulating the two of them, right? So you might go to mom and you might say, Mom, Dad said that if you said that, yes, I could have a soda, or something like that, right? So you're trying to, whatever the conflict is, you're trying to loop in a third person. Another example of this might be if Jane and John are married, and Jane wants to have more kids. Wait, Jane and John. Let me choose different names. If Bob and Jane are married, and Jane is focused on her work, she's focused on her career, but Bob wants more kids, and they say they already have a daughter. And so Bob might say, I talked to our daughter Rose, and man, she really would love a sibling. Bob is now triangulating. He's bringing their daughter into the relationship and the conversation, even though, it's a conversation that Bob and his wife should have, Bob and Jane should have. Their daughter really has no say in it. But he's triangulating his daughter into it. Oh, Rose really would love a sibling. I really want more kids. So that's another example of how triangulation can look. So it's bringing a third person in, or a third entity in, even though they really don't have any reason to be in the conversation. It's a way to manipulate someone, which is why it's not healthy, why it's not good. But you see this happening very frequently once you start to see it or pay attention to it. The last thing I'll talk about here on the slide is multi-generational transmission process. This is fascinating. It describes how the ability to build healthy and intimate relationships with others can be passed down through generations within the family, and or conversely, how unhealthy relationships or unhealthy behaviors can be passed down, or how traumas can be passed down. So, for example, if someone's grandpa was abusive, say Phil's grandpa was abusive to his son, and then, his son, whose name is John, I'm running out of names here. John is then abusive to his son, Peter. Now you've got Philip, who's abusive to John, and John is abusive to Peter, and it just continues to roll downhill, or it continues to impact until eventually, someone gets to a point, maybe, or, realizes, hey, this is continuing to happen. I need to be I need to be the person who makes change for our family, or stops this behavior from continuing. But it's those things that continue to roll downhill or continue to impact the next generation until someone says, hey, this is really unhealthy. So Peter might realize, hey, my dad was abusive, my grandpa was abusive to him. I'm not going to be abusive to my son because I see how unhealthy that is. It could also be more subtle than that, though, right? That's something that's very obvious that we might see. It could be something that's way more subtle that unless we're really looking for it or paying attention to it, we might not notice it. So, for example, say someone was abused when they were a kid. Say Susan was abused when she was a little girl. And so that, of course, impacts who she becomes. As she's raised, it impacts what her goals are, what her decision making is, all of those different things. And then when she has kids, she might be more hypervigilant or less trusting of other people, especially less trusting when, in terms of who her kids interact with or how they're treated. She might not let her kids go to sleepovers because she's worried about, like, well, what if abuse happens during a sleepover? And so, even though her kids aren't like strongly, directly impacted, kids pick up on a lot of stuff, even if they maybe don't necessarily have the words or the language to put it to be able to articulate it. And so, right, because kids they see everything and they like copy everything and stuff. And so, um, Susan's kids might pick up on it, kind of this like, well, mom's really hyper vigilant or anxious about stuff, or mom is really untrusting, and then they become untrusting, or they start to, maybe be kind of hyper vigilant about stuff. And so that's another example of how this multi generational transmission process can continue to impact generations on and on and on, even though generations from now they might not understand. Well, uh, think about wars that are fought, right? Like, well, why are we fighting this war? I don't know, because my grandma and my great grandma and my great 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 grandma were all fighting this war, so I'm going to fight it because that's what they believed in or that's what they were doing. And so it's fascinating if you start to think about it, how much impact, what are the things that we do or the things that we say that are really just come from our grandma or our great grandma or our great grandpa or whatever, whoever that family member is. And we're not even realizing or paying attention to or aware of, like, oh, where does this family, tradition come from, or this family behavior come from, or this family habit? Like, why do we all do this or say this? And it's not until you really kind of start to dig into things that you're like, oh, this is where this comes from, or this is why we do this, or this is why this makes sense. Differentiation, I think I talked about this a little bit previously, but it's the process of freeing yourself from your family's processes, essentially to define yourself. Part of this therapy approach is very much exploring identity and understanding what is your identity versus what is your family's identity. So this means being able to differentiate and differ in terms of opinions, in terms of values from your family members, but also being able to still stay emotionally connected to them. So for example, if you were raised in a very religious household, you grow up, you go to college, you realize that maybe religion isn't really for you, but your family still pushes being religious or continuing to go to church. You may realize, that's really not for me, or maybe you say, I'm interested in a different version of religion. Part of therapy might be getting to a point where you're comfortable or confident in that, or being, you're accepting of who you are, or even accepting of the fact that your family is going to continue to push you of come back to our religion is the correct religion, or something like that. Or that being accepting that, all right, I know my family is going to continue to judge me or continue to treat me this way, and that's just how it's going to be. But again, it's that differentiation of saying, okay, well, this is my family's values, or this is what's important to my family, but what's important to me? What are my values? And being able to understand the differences and be comfortable and confident with your differences, as opposed to continuing to, solely be who or what your family wants you to be. Detriangulation. So we talked about triangulation. So part of therapy goals is to detriangulate. So getting yourself out of that triangle if it is occurring. Understanding multi-generational impact. We talked about that in a previous slide, but in terms of therapy and goals, understanding that, exploring what that means for whoever the family is, or whoever that, if you're only focusing on or working with one person, not an entire family, what that looks like for them, helping them talk through and explore that. Opening closed ties. So a lot of times we avoid conflict and our clients avoid conflict. So part of therapy would be opening up about that, exploring and essentially kind of um, bridging those gaps or strengthening those ties. So working with family members so that they can resolve their differences in a constructive way. So essentially, if you've got a family member or you've got a family who experiences a lot of conflict or experiences conflict around, a certain thing. Um, I want to say politics, but not politics because that might that might result in a lot of work that's needed. Uh, but if you've got a family that they they avoid conflict, part of the therapy and part of the goal would be, okay, how, instead of avoiding this conflict, how do we work through it in a healthy way, and how do we work through it in a way that we're able to resolve these differences without it becoming, a big argument, or, a blow up over Thanksgiving, or, something that results in, like, all right, I'm not talking to you until the next holiday. Good luck. See ya. You know what I mean? Because that's maybe not how you want to be with your family. I will talk about genograms more in the next slide. So often a strong focus is put on the process. So asking questions, asking how questions. So for example, in terms of that processing, how does the family interact? How do they go about planning events? How do they handle disagreements? How do they handle conflict? Who is the person that brings everyone in the family together? How do they go about doing that? Do they call people? Do they text people? Do they send out, no one really seems to send out formal invitations anymore. But how does this person go about bringing the family together? How are family events organized? Who shows up to them? And, all of those things are important in terms of understanding who this family is and how they interact with each other. And in terms of who shows up, sometimes family will only show up if, oh, well, are you going to this? You're not going to this? Well, I'm not going to this. Or, especially if it's, say some type of religious differences that may occur. Oh, well, is it scheduled on Saturday or Sunday? What does that look like? And so there's a lot that can go into this, right? Again, depending on who the family is, how the individuals are raised, etc. I think we've talked about experiments quite a bit, especially during the behavioral class. Um, Experiments can be helpful to use, and role plays, of course, hopefully you can understand how helpful it can be in many different ways, as you might have a family or a family member specifically do some type of experiment or do some type of role play, in order to, again, help the family shift their perspective, increase that awareness, increase in understanding. So, for example, if you've got someone, say, say little Annie's growing up and she wants to, we've talked about this, or I've used this example before. She wants to go get an art degree or do something in art, and her family's all like, go to school, be a doctor, be an engineer, become a nurse, do something where you're not going to end up homeless and under a bridge, because, art degrees, you're not going to make money. You're going to be a starving artist. An experiment or a role play that you could use as a therapist working with this family is to help the family overall shift their perspective around Annie wanting to pursue this degree or wanting to pursue this specific career, and help them understand why it's important to Annie. And because otherwise it could maybe be causing a lot of conflict or a lot of avoidance, which we've already just talked about. And so, how do we incorporate this family member, Annie, because Annie might be feeling really, maybe not unloved, that's too extreme, but she might not be feeling supported by family. And so, how do you help her feel supported, but also help her family, maybe her parents or siblings, understand why this is so important to her? So that can be a fun exercise or a fun technique to use. I statements, I think that's probably pretty obvious. I statements, you guys probably are familiar with those. Saying I instead of you, right? So you never take out the trash. You never help with cooking dinner, as opposed to I feel like you never take out the trash, or I feel like you never help cook dinner, or I feel frustrated when I think, or when I have the thought that you never cook dinner. I'm pretty sure we've talked about that in previous classes. The genogram, so this outlines the general like structure or connection of a family, who's connected to who. It collects that basic information, and it collects descriptions of family members. And if you type in genograms, or if you see examples, there's a couple different examples in your textbook. There's different ways, and some of these get really detailed in terms of symbols to describe, oh, this person and this person are having a conflict, or this person, is estranged from this person and they haven't talked for 20 years, or this person and this person were married but now they're divorced and now this person is remarried, etc. And so it really helps you in a very, if you're visual, get a really solid understanding of the family and who interacts with who and what those interactions look like, if they're healthy, if they're estranged, etc. There is a genogram worksheet in Canvas, so this would be an exercise if you wanted to do for a discussion post. I previously worked with a client, so hopefully this will help just kind of understand it, help you guys kind of see the example of a genogram. I'll just talk through it though. I'm not going to actually, use the picture from the slide. That's just to show you what a genogram looks like. So I previously worked with a client who was also in her mid-20s, and she was engaged and she was working and planning her wedding. Her wedding was going to be out of state, so it would end up being back home where her family was. Her wedding, again, it was local to where her family was, not to where she was living at the time. And she was experiencing a lot of passive aggressiveness from her stepmom. So her father married her stepmom when this client, I'll call her, what's a good name to call her? I'm running out of names, guys. I'm not very good at coming up with these on the spot. Anne. I've already used Anne today, but I'll use Anne again. So we'll call her Anne. Her father had married her stepmom. We'll call her stepmom Stephanie. So her stepmom Stephanie when Anne was very young, maybe like 5 or 6 years old. And Stephanie had always treated Anne very negatively, like said really negative stuff to her, like, you're so fat, you need to lose weight, you're so lazy, you don't work hard enough, like that kind of stuff. And the stepmom had come into the marriage with a daughter who was 4 or 5 years younger than Jane. And, the stepmom, a very typical, stereotypical stepmom story here. The stepmom, of course, treated her daughter very well, didn't say those types of things to her. And so in therapy, we spent quite a bit of time exploring, how is your stepmom treating you in the past? How is she treating you currently? How does your dad treat you? How does your dad treat you in regard, like in relation to how your stepmom treats you? Or, like if your stepmom says something to your stepdad, does that impact how he treats you? Like that type of thing. So we spend a lot of time exploring that. And at the point while we were working through treatment, the stepmom was making a really big deal out of this wedding. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing it that way? Why do you want that to be a part of the wedding ceremony? Why do you want that to be your wedding colors? Why did you choose that date? And if I remember correctly, my client, Anne, had set the date like months and months ago. And then the stepmom basically came and said, like, well, we were planning on going to Cancun, or they were planning on going somewhere tropical, and we were planning on going that day or that weekend, and now we can't go because of your wedding, even though my client had had her wedding planned like for months. And so the stepmom was, I think, being really passive aggressive and essentially trying to be like, why can't you move your wedding to a different day? And so Anne's father was also kind of being very passive about everything and avoiding conflict with his wife, Stephanie. So, Stephanie was making this big deal out of everything. And from talking to my client in therapy, it sounded like Stephanie would go to the father and say, Anne needs to move her wedding day, or why is she doing this? This is dumb. Her wedding colors are stupid, whatever she was saying. And then the father would call my client Anne and say, well, can you change this? Can you change that? It's not really lining up with, our schedule, etc. And so part of what we were talking about in terms of therapy was, is your dad setting healthy boundaries? Is he looking out for you, or is he looking out for, your stepmom, Stephanie? Is he, actually dealing with the conflict that's happening in his house, or is he just kind of like projecting that onto you, or like passively aggressively putting that on you in terms of like, hey, can you change your wedding date? What does he really care about, or what's important to him? And so that was all some of the stuff that we explored in therapy, and explored, of course, coping strategies, and how my client could work through all of that. And so it's again, maybe not the best example in terms of genogram, but just an example of how family, even if your approach isn't family therapy, how family therapy can kind of come into the individual therapy space, because we all have relationships with other individuals. And so a big part of therapy with that client as well was helping her understand her own family relationships, and how those were impacting her. At the time, she was experiencing a lot of stress because of her stepmom and how her stepmom was treating her. And so helping her understand where that stress was coming from, how it was driven, what was triggering that. And again, some ways to cope with it, but also, hey, what are the boundaries that you're setting? How are you reacting to these things, etc. So here are discussion questions. You've got a couple different options there in terms of prompts to choose from. A big part of this therapy approach is talking about boundaries. And I've mentioned boundaries several times at this point. And we talked previously a little bit ago about that spectrum in terms of individuality versus togetherness, so separateness versus fusion. And part of this is resolving issues regarding boundaries and expectations. So you must first, of course, recognize that a problem exists, be willing to address the problem, be responsible for your part of the problem, be willing to acknowledge any consequences of your actions, and hold the perspective that it is worth your time to do so. In terms of rigid boundaries, so again, this is pretty disengaged. You heard that occur in a client that I talked about a few minutes ago, in terms of she essentially tried to limit the contact that she had with her mom, because her mom tended to be verbally abusive. And so, she would try and spend maybe, one weekend a month with her mom, or have limited phone calls, or cut, like talking to her mom in a week or in a month. Whereas enmeshment, what's a good example of this? A good example, I'll use a very stereotypical example. Like, think of someone who's a mama's boy, or think about a couple who maybe just started dating and they're like tied at the hip. They're like always together. They're never separate. A mama's boy would be, there's no real clear identity. Like, he calls his mom for everything. There's no separation in terms of like, well, if you talk to him and he says this and this, XYZ, you're like, is that coming from you, or is that coming from your mom? Because that sounds exactly like what your mom would say. And so, in terms of boundaries and thinking about boundaries and thinking about how our clients are interacting with their family members, are they, like disengaged? I don't really talk to my family, they're unhealthy. Are they overly or too engaged? There's, like no separation or identity between them and their family. If you're talking about one, you're talking about the other. Or are they able to have kind of this healthy level of relationship boundaries, where it's like, all right, I have identity, but I'm also an individual, and we can talk and interact without, being super disengaged. So a big part of what I'll spend time focusing on in therapy with clients is exploring boundaries, helping them build boundaries. Because again, this isn't something that we tend to talk about or tend to think about. And so until it's brought up in therapy, it's like, oh, I'd never thought about that. Or like, oh, this is something I need to work on. And it can be really beneficial to help individuals get to kind of that healthy level of boundary, as opposed to being at one extreme or the other. Going back to CBT, we talked about those extremes. As with any other therapy we've discussed, the client or family member has to want to change, right? So, of course, we can't force people to change. And this is present in family therapy as well. If you guys watch Rick and Morty, there's an episode or a couple episodes where the mom in the TV show starts to go to family therapy. And at some point, she like drags Rick along. But you can tell he doesn't want to change. He's not actually interested in being there. He does finally go, but still kind of continues to refuse to change. And so, again, highlighting that is you're going to see that in any therapy, the individual, or in this case, the family that's showing up to your office for therapy has to want to change. Um, and I would say that kind of consistently everybody wants to change, right? It can be really hard if one person shows up, like in this example that I shared, the mom shows up and she wants to change, but then, Rick doesn't actually want to change. So how much change can really actually occur if only one side is willing to take all the action and the other side is like, I'm not really interested in making change. So Gottman is can be really helpful in terms of working with couples, but also just the family in general. Again, thinking about one of the main focuses of therapy, no matter who you're treating, is increasing awareness, helping behavior changes occur. This book can be beneficial whether you're dating, already married, engaged, etc. Because again, it increases awareness around what are our differences, what are our values, what are my values versus what are your values, what are my priorities or goals, etc., etc. So I've uploaded. It's a 38-page. It's a workbook, not really a worksheet, which has a bunch of the different exercises that are from this book. And I've used it again. I haven't done family therapy, but I have used it with individuals who come in who either want help for if they're in a relationship with someone else or if they're experiencing some type of family difficulties. The love map. So this is essentially helping a couple connect or reconnect, and helping them understand what are our likes, what are our dislikes, what are our similarities, what are our differences, what do we have in common. It can also help individuals explore, how did your family deal with conflict? How does my family deal with conflict? All of those things that a lot of times we don't necessarily talk about or think about. I really like using the Four Horsemen. And again, I've used it a lot with individuals. But again, we oftentimes it's really easy to say, he doesn't do this, she doesn't do that, he never takes out the trash, she never helps with dinner. And so this can bring it back to focusing on, again, okay, well, what do we need to fix? What are we doing within the relationship? And Gottman, they have a research lab. They've done tons and tons of research. And so for the things that Gottman has explored in terms of things that really are really harmful to relationships is criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And so I will use this worksheet with a therapy client and say, let's explore what are the things that you're doing in when conflict occurs or when you're being avoidant or when there's some type of disagreement in the relationship. What does that look like? What are you doing? So bringing it back to the client. And then part of that is also, all right, if you're doing these things, what are some things that are healthier? So then we'll talk about those antidotes in terms of gentle startup, building a culture of appreciation, taking responsibility, the self-soothing, to help the client start to engage in healthier coping strategies within the relationship, and take a healthier approach as opposed to continuing to engage in those behaviors that are negatively impacting the relationship. So this could be a fun exercise if you want to explore and think about what are the things that you might be doing in a relationship that is maybe not as helpful as you want it to be. And then one of the things that I also really like doing when working with clients is using the love language assessment, because again, I think a lot of times we aren't aware of what our needs are in a relationship, or we don't think about those things. And so having clients start to think about, well, what do you need in a relationship? How are your needs met or not being met? And how do you communicate that to your significant other, to whoever your loved ones are for the relationship? so that those needs are, do start to become met, are starting to become met. uh and so that you feel more fulfilled within the relationship, you feel more loved, you have more belonging, etc. And this is something that, again, if you're not thinking about, you might have someone who their love language is physical touch, and so that's how they want love to be expressed to them. But then their significant other might be receiving gifts, and so their significant other wants to receive gifts or expresses his or her love language in terms of gifts. And so, your partner might be like, I get gifts, but that doesn't really fill my love cup, like I want physical touch. And so helping them understand that and improving that connection in their communication around those things can be really helpful for either your client or the overall relationship to become more fulfilled and getting those needs met in a healthy way, as opposed to like, something that ends up in conflict, or is like, my needs aren't being met, but I don't know how to ask for it, or I don't know how to explore that with my client. That's it for this week. You guys let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Thank you.